Hi, I'm Drew Ruck, and today we're going to be doing a tutorial on polygraph tests. So I labeled it Science Solving Honesty because it's just sort of a weird middle ground between science and justice. So first off, it's important to understand what polygraphs actually measure. So they measure heart rate, galvanic skin response, which is a fancy way of talking about sweating, respiration, or like breathing, and then sometimes they measure blood pressure, although that seems to be dependent on the polygraph. Some of the fancy ones measure more things. And then the combination of all of these things is what gives us like the level of excitement a person is going through. Not like happy excitement, more like physiological excitement. And it's assumed that people who are lying will have a higher level of excitement because, they're nervous, they're lying, they're doing something they're not supposed to. So it's assumed that, yeah, these lies will cause this higher level of excitement. So given this different data, we kind of have to figure out what it means. So here I have just sort of like a very basic polygraph chart. So usually it's laid out with respiration on the top, then the sweat, which this one calls electrodermal activity. It seems that there's different names, but it's always sort of measuring sweat response, and then heart rate or blood pressure on the bottom. And generally it's assumed that higher heart rate and more sweating is what causes a lie. Respiratory rate's a little weird because sometimes people say that it's like faster breathing is what's causing a lie, and some people say it's like pausing and sort of like freezing up on breathing before answering. That's what causes the lie. So that's sort of more about the polygraph tester's opinion on it. Um, but either way, the respiratory rate is measured, and it's always based on some sort of change on the respiratory rate, even though there's some discussion on what changes are more indicative of lying. Uh, um, and yeah, the graphs usually look something like this. I mean, we all did a lab on polygraphs, so that definitely does help, but they are rather confusing to interpret. So that sort of brings us to the issues with polygraphs, which are a lot of what the book actually focused on. So polygraph testing. The first issue is that stress causes almost all the same reactions as lying, and that's because how we look for lies is if people kind of have this higher state of physiological arousal, which is also what happens when you're stressed, right? You get stressed, you kind of start sweating, your breathing gets thrown off, your heart rate gets faster. So when you're setting people up in polygraph like tests, that's a stressful situation. So by putting people in a stressful situation where you're measuring something that you're basically measuring the same responses as somebody would have to stress, that can cause a lot of problems. So polygraphs try to do a lot of stuff like giving people the questions beforehand, walking them through, saying they're like not in trouble or anything to try to make people less stressed, so that the answers will less be thrown off, or be thrown off less. But either way, stress does cause a lot of problems for polygraphs because polygraphs don't actually measure lying. They measure all these physical responses, and those are also triggered by stress. Another thing is that the environment can cause just varying levels of physiological arousal or excitement. Just because if there's a lot going on in the room, if people are caught off guard, if people are startled by a noise outside, this can cause them to pause in breathing or perhaps up their heart rate briefly. And once again, because polygraphs can't actually measure lying, they simply measure this combination of various physical responses. The polygraph can't actually measure that. And then, of course, there's also just some people aren't that bothered by lying. Um, so these are sort of things where there's sort of false positives. Things throw people off, and this makes it look like a lie. But there's also false negatives where people lie blatantly, and it's just they're not that bothered by it, and so they don't have the full set of physiological responses, meaning it catches it as the truth because their heart rate doesn't go up, they don't start sweating more. Um, yeah. And then there's also person by person conditions. I wasn't entirely sure to name this. This is things like people's heart conditions or sort of people's like individual stress levels or experiences where various people will have different reactions to polygraphs. And a lot of this can be hard to know beforehand because, yeah, if a person routinely has high blood pressure spikes and they get a spike during a polygraph, that'll look like a lie, but it could have something totally else to do with, you know, their own health issues. So this leads to polygraphs having a 60 to 85% success rate, which the question's kind of what do we make of that? Because 60% success rate is very bad. That's just kind of guessing if people are lying. But 85% success rate is not very good either. Um, so that's sort of the discussion that our book was focusing on. It brought up the thing of if you interrogate 1,000 people with an 80% success rate, you'll still let some of the guilty ones go while imprisoning a vast number of innocent people. Um, so although polygraphs are imperfect as lie detectors, even with the highest estimates, they still are of some use because you do get measurements. It's just important to remember that the measurements are measuring somebody's physiological responses and not actually whether they're lying. And also sources if you're at all curious. And thank you. That's all I have.